Since a ceasefire agreement came into effect on October 10, 2025, multiple reporting agencies and health authorities in Gaza have documented continued violence and casualties in the Gaza Strip, including killings and injuries attributed to Israeli military actions during periods in which the ceasefire was supposed to be active. According to the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza, at least 477 Palestinians have been killed and approximately 1,300 injured by Israeli attacks since that ceasefire came into force. Deaths and injuries recorded since beginning of ceasefire. Figures from Gaza's government media office and the Palestinian Ministry of Health show a steadily rising toll of fatalities and injuries in Gaza attributed to Israeli military action despite the ceasefire agreement. By late November 2025, Gaza authorities reported at least 357 Palestinians killed and 903 others wounded in Israeli attacks since the October 10 ceasefire began. Separate reporting from Gaza health sources noted 418 Palestinians killed and 1,171 wounded by early January 2026 due to ceasefire violations. Independent tracking by Al Jazeera showed that, because of repeated violations, Israel had carried out attacks on 89 of the first 104 days after the ceasefire took effect. These figures are tracked by hospital admissions and official health ministry bulletins maintained by Gaza authorities, which tally deaths and injuries on a rolling basis. Patterns of violence and reported incidents. Even after the ceasefire was declared, a pattern of hostilities continued in Gaza that local officials and some media describe as violations of the agreement. The Gaza government media office documented hundreds of ceasefire violations, including airstrikes, artillery fire, direct shootings at civilians, raids into civilian areas, destruction of homes, and detentions of Palestinians. On at least one occasion, dozens of Palestinians were reported killed on the same day in attacks following an accumulation of incidents over preceding days. One such spate of violence in late October resulted in 109 deaths, including many children. Local health and civil defense reports document continuing shootings near or across a so-called yellow line, a demarcation related to the ceasefire terms, with civilians, including children, shot and killed, even within designated safe areas. In addition to direct military actions, repeated shelling and raids into residential areas have been documented by multiple independent and local sources throughout the ceasefire period. Recent incidents reported by international outlets. Several news organizations have reported specific lethal incidents in Gaza during the ceasefire period. On January 21, 2026, Israeli strikes were reported to have killed at least 11 Palestinians, including two 13-year-old boys and 3 journalists who were documenting humanitarian conditions in a displacement camp. International press organizations confirmed that journalists from the Egyptian Relief Committee were killed in the strike. Earlier in January, at least 5 civilians, including a 16-year-old, were reported killed in separate Israeli airstrikes in Deir al-Balah. These reported incidents occurred at moments when the ceasefire was still formally considered in effect. Broader casualty and humanitarian context. The toll from Israeli attacks and associated conflict exceeds the specific figures since the ceasefire in October, and local health authorities have continued to compile cumulative casualty figures from the overall conflict. As of mid-December 2025, Gaza's health ministry reported thousands of cumulative deaths and injuries since the outset of the larger Israel-Hamas war in October 2023. Hospitals in Gaza have operated under extreme strain, facing limited medical supplies, fuel shortages, and infrastructure damage, complicating the treatment of casualties from ongoing violence. Beyond direct injuries and deaths attributable to military attacks, humanitarian conditions in Gaza have deteriorated sharply. Winter storms, shortages of medical supplies, and collapsed infrastructure have contributed to additional harm, particularly to children and vulnerable populations, with reports of deaths from hypothermia referenced by independent health observers. Ceasefire violations and reporting. Multiple sources tracking the ceasefire report high numbers of violations attributed to Israeli military actions. The Gaza Government Media Office has documented hundreds of incidents labeled as ceasefire violations, including bombardments, shootings, and demolition operations. A breakdown of types of violations, including direct gunfire towards civilians, bombardment of populated areas, detention of civilians, and destruction of property. Independent media monitoring has also tracked alleged violations over time, illustrating a continued pattern of conflict despite the ceasefire declaration. Human impact and conditions. The ongoing violence, both direct military action and the broader humanitarian crisis, has had devastating effects on the population of Gaza. Displacement on a massive scale has left many families in makeshift shelters under harsh conditions throughout the ceasefire period. International rights groups and local civil defense agencies report that civilians, including women, children, and journalists, have been killed in attacks as they carried out daily activities or humanitarian work. Fear and uncertainty persist among residents, with many civilians living in areas where the ceasefire line is ambiguous or unmarked, increasing the risk of lethal engagements with security forces. Since the ceasefire in Gaza took effect on October 10, 2025, nations, international organizations, and multilateral bodies have reacted in a variety of ways to reported ongoing violence, violations of the ceasefire, and the broader humanitarian situation in the Palestinian territory. These responses span diplomatic condemnations, humanitarian efforts, expert appeals, and political initiatives. Each reaction reflects differing priorities, from demanding compliance with humanitarian law to facilitating aid access and attempting new peace efforts. Below is a comprehensive, fact-based examination of these verified international responses. United Nations, condemnations and urgent appeals. United Nations experts have issued strong statements urging states and parties to enforce the ceasefire agreement and protect civilians. In November 2025, UN human rights experts stated that Israeli military actions that continued after the ceasefire constituted blatant violations of the agreement, resulting in deaths and injuries among civilians, including children. They urged all states to act to stop attacks on civilians and to ensure unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid, including medical assistance. UN statements consistently emphasize that civilian protection and humanitarian access are core obligations under international law, and that continued hostilities threaten the fragile truce, increasing the risk of renewed large-scale conflict. The broader UN system has also regularly published situation bulletins detailing the impact of the conflict and the ceasefire on civilians, humanitarian delivery, and human rights conditions. These bulletins highlight repeated hostilities and underscore the need for full implementation of ceasefire terms. State and regional government responses. Qatar has been among the regional states that publicly criticized ongoing violations of the ceasefire. The Qatari emir condemned Israel's actions as violations of international norms and emphasized that the ceasefire must be respected and that the Gaza Strip should not be turned into an uninhabitable zone for Palestinians. Other states in the region, including Turkey, have voiced concern about breaches in ceasefire terms and supported diplomatic efforts to push for continued pauses in fighting, humanitarian access, and a durable peace framework. At multilateral meetings, representatives from several Arab and Muslim-majority countries have called for pressure on parties to uphold the truce. Humanitarian organizations and civil society. United Nations, agencies, and international NGOs have responded by attempting to scale up aid delivery and highlight urgent humanitarian needs. Agencies like UNICEF have reported efforts to bring food, medical supplies, clean water, and protective materials for children and families into Gaza during the ceasefire period, while warning that basic services remain deeply disrupted and the needs extremely high. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, documented resumed bread production and the entry of limited cooking gas, as well as efforts to distribute food and sustain basic supplies for civilians, important markers of aid growth after prolonged isolation and blockade conditions. Humanitarian agencies have emphasized that while the ceasefire has allowed some increased aid access compared with prior periods of intense fighting, major gaps remain, including restricted border crossings and severe shortages of medicine, fuel, and other basic goods. International, diplomatic, and political initiatives. High-profile international initiatives have sought to reinforce the ceasefire framework and support longer-term stabilization efforts. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, the U.S. administration under President Donald Trump launched a new initiative called the Board of Peace, intended to help maintain the ceasefire and support diplomatic efforts, including disarmament of armed groups and facilitation of humanitarian access. This effort involved commitments from dozens of countries, although several major U.S. allies like Britain, France, Norway, Sweden, and Canada chose not to participate, citing concerns about the board's legal implications or geopolitical composition. Discussions among mediators including Egypt, Qatar, and the United States have continued, aimed at creating mechanisms to monitor ceasefire compliance, prevent further violations, and negotiate phase-by-phase implementation of peace terms. Responses to specific violations and casualties. Major news outlets and rights groups have highlighted international reactions when specific violations resulted in civilian deaths. On January 21, 2026, at least 11 Palestinians, including children and journalists documenting humanitarian conditions, were killed by Israeli forces. International press organizations and media rights groups called for independent investigations into these deaths and for enhanced measures to protect journalists and civilians operating in conflict zones under ceasefire conditions. Such incidents drew criticism from human rights advocates and diplomatic voices internationally, who repeatedly urged compliance with international humanitarian law. Broader context in international law and policy. Responses from legal and human rights advocacy bodies have stressed the importance of upholding international law during and after the ceasefire. Prior rulings and advocacy from bodies like the International Commission of Jurists have condemned prior breaches of ceasefire terms in earlier phases of the conflict and called for immediate ceasefire, protection of civilians, and prevention of further forcible displacement. Although these positions predate the latest truce, they reflect long-standing international legal expectations about conduct during armed conflict. International legal advocacy continues to call on states to ensure that all parties adhere to international humanitarian law and that violations, whether affecting civilians or infrastructure, are fully investigated and addressed. Summary of international trends. Across these varied responses, several themes emerge in the international reaction to ongoing violence and ceasefire violations in Gaza. Many countries and multilateral bodies have condemned violence against civilians and urged compliance with the ceasefire agreement, emphasizing respect for humanitarian law. Humanitarian organizations have worked to increase aid delivery, addressing food insecurity, shelter needs, health care, and child protection. Regional states like Qatar and Turkey have publicly criticized Israeli violations, advocating for urgent action to uphold ceasefire terms and prevent further civilian harm. Diplomatic efforts continue, including initiatives at global forums to sustain peace processes and involve as broad a set of international partners as possible. Calls for independent investigation and accountability follow major incidents in which civilians, aid workers, or journalists are killed. These international responses occur against a backdrop of continuing conflict dynamics and ongoing humanitarian suffering, underscoring the complex and contested nature of efforts to solidify a sustainable ceasefire and protect civilians in Gaza.